Long before ruling the Soviet Union with an iron fist, a frail boy born in a small town in Tsarist Georgia began a journey that would forever change the course of the 20th century. Josef Stalin, a central figure in communism, Stalinism, and a construction of the Soviet totalitarian regime, walked a path marked by imprisonments, escapes, betrayals, and global wars. He faced internal enemies, led massive economic plans, controlled the Red Army with severity, and survived the rise and fall of political allies. This is the complete story of how a seminary student became the most feared leader of the Soviet bloc, and how his shadow stretched through the Russian Revolution, World War II, the Cold War, and the repression of millions.
In the late 19th century, the Russian Empire ruled over a vast portion of Eastern Europe and Asia, uniting diverse peoples under a centralized and autocratic regime. Among the territories under its control was Georgia, a region marked by strong religious tradition, ethnic tensions, and suppressed aspirations for independence. In this turbulent setting, in 1878, Ioseb Jughashvili was born in a small town called Gori. The son of an unstable shoemaker and a deeply religious mother, his childhood would be shaped by poverty, family conflict, and illness. Yet from that humble environment would emerge a figure who would radically alter the course of the 20th century and leave deep marks on the modern world. Josef Stalin was born on December 18, 1878, in the town of Gori, Georgia, then part of the Russian Empire. His birth name was Ioseb Jughashvili. He was the son of Vissarion, an alcoholic shoemaker, and Ekaterine, a devout peasant woman. Stalin grew up in a turbulent and violent household. His father frequently beat him, while his mother did everything she could to ensure he received a religious education, hoping he would become an Orthodox priest. From an early age, Stalin faced health problems, including a bout of smallpox that left scars on his face and an accident that permanently injured one of his arms. Despite his family and physical difficulties, Stalin excelled in his studies. His mother managed to enroll him in the local church school, where he learned Russian, since the regional language was primarily Georgian. Later, he was admitted to the Tiflis Theological Seminary, a conservative Orthodox institution. It was in this environment that Stalin began drifting away from Christian beliefs and became exposed to revolutionary ideas. Secret readings of banned authors such as Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels awakened in him a deep interest in Marxism and in opposing Tsarist rule. At the seminary, Stalin developed a rebellious stance toward authority and religious doctrine. He participated in secret circles that discussed politics and distributed pamphlets considered subversive by the imperial police. In 1899, he was expelled from the seminary, officially for missing classes, although his involvement in revolutionary activities had already drawn attention from authorities. From that point forward, he abandoned his religious path entirely and fully embraced political militancy. After leaving the seminary, Stalin worked as a meteorologist at the Tiflis Observatory, but his main focus became underground activity within the Georgian socialist movement. He joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party and began organizing strikes, protests, and actions against the Tsarist regime. During this period, he adopted the pseudonym Koba, inspired by a Georgian folk hero known for his courage and vengeance against injustice. In the following years, Stalin immersed himself in revolutionary activism. He organized Marxist cells, wrote articles for underground newspapers, and strengthened connections with Bolshevik leaders, including Vladimir Lenin, who was still in exile. At the same time, he faced constant persecution by the Tsarist secret police and protected his identity using multiple aliases. The repression of revolutionary movements made political activism dangerous and often fatal. Stalin's youth was marked by frequent relocations, contact with Marxist intellectuals, and involvement in clandestine networks. He quickly stood out among militants for his discipline, pragmatism, and ability to organize direct action. His experience on the streets of Georgia and the Caucasus prepared him for the greater challenges he would face in the decades to come. Meanwhile, his actions were already drawing the attention of the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police. Amid this radicalization process, Stalin also developed a strategic mindset that aimed to connect the revolutionary cause with the local realities of the Georgian people. Unlike other militants who stayed focused on theory, Stalin engaged directly with workers, peasants, and trade unions. His fluency in both Russian and Georgian made him a valuable link between the party's central leadership and the outer regions of the Russian Empire. By the end of this initial phase of his life, Stalin had left behind not only a difficult childhood, but also the religious identity his mother had once envisioned. The young Ioseb Jughashvili had become the militant known as Koba, a name that would soon evolve into the powerful and feared Josef Stalin, central figure of the Russian Revolution and the future Soviet communist regime.
At the beginning of the 20th century, Joseph Stalin was solidifying his position within the revolutionary movement. Already known as Koba, he operated primarily in the Caucasus, where he organized strikes, protests, and actions against the Tsarist regime. He became an influential operative in the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, taking on roles in logistics, propaganda, and clandestine fundraising. One of the most notable episodes of this period was the Tiflis bank robbery in 1907, which yielded large sums of money for the party and firmly placed Stalin on the radar at the Okhrana. The Tiflis operation was carefully planned. Using dynamite and firearms, the group led by Stalin attacked the bank stagecoach in broad daylight, resulting in casualties. The action drew internal criticism from some Bolsheviks, but it was tolerated by Lenin, who saw Koba as someone willing to do what others would not dare. The financial success of the operation also secured Stalin's prestige within the most radical factions of the party. From that point on, his life became increasingly clandestine. He used multiple aliases, moved frequently between cities, and met with militants in safe houses. Between 1902 and 1913, Stalin was arrested several times by Tsarist authorities. Each time he was exiled to remote regions of Siberia. However, in most of these instances, he managed to escape. These repeated escapes strengthened his reputation as a skilled, resilient man, deeply committed to the revolutionary cause. In 1911, after yet another escape, Stalin returned to St. Petersburg and intensified his organizational work within the party. He was responsible for editing Bolshevik newspapers, such as Pravda, and coordinating with workers in key factories. His discreet and effective activity caught the attention of Lenin, who began to view Stalin as a reliable ally for sensitive missions. Although not yet part of the party's intellectual elite, his practical influence was growing quickly. During this period, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party split into Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Stalin firmly aligned with the Bolsheviks, the faction led by Lenin that advocated for seizing power through armed revolution. This decision defined his political path and shaped his actions in the years ahead. His loyalty to Lenin and his ability to confront the Tsarist repressive apparatus cemented his role in the inner circle of the movement. Amid internal tensions and external persecutions, Stalin adopted an increasingly reserved profile. Uninterested in public debates or theoretical discourse, he preferred to operate behind the scenes, building support networks and establishing control. This strategic approach would later become a hallmark of his leadership in the Soviet Union. In the meantime, he accumulated experience in security, espionage, and managing internal party conflicts. Through repeated imprisonments, exiles, and escapes, Stalin developed a reputation for persistence and cold determination. He was already seen as someone who could survive all adversities, whether from Tsarist repression or internal party rivalries.
This resilience made him a key figure in preparing for the decisive events of 1917. His story up to that point revealed a clear trajectory of ascent, grounded in discipline and a talent for operating in the shadows of the revolutionary movement. By the end of this cycle of secrecy and repression, Stalin was ready to take on an even more significant role within the Bolshevik structure. The next stage of his life would unfold in the context of World War I and the growing public dissatisfaction with the Tsarist regime, a fertile ground for the outbreak of the Russian Revolution.
In 1917, the Russian Revolution completely transformed the political landscape of the Russian Empire, creating space for figures like Josef Stalin to rise with even greater prominence. That year, Russia experienced two revolutions. The first, in February, overthrew Tsar Nicholas II and established a provisional government. The second, in October, was led by the Bolsheviks, who seized power under Lenin's leadership. Stalin played a relevant role in this process, working behind the scenes in party organization and influencing key strategic decisions. Stalin, then nearly 40 years old, took on important positions in the Bolshevik Party's Central Committee. Although he was not among the great orators or theorists of the movement, his disciplined, discreet, and effective performance made him a key player during critical moments. During the days of the October Revolution, he helped coordinate orders for occupations and control the communication and transportation systems in Petrograd. After the Bolsheviks seized power, Stalin was appointed People's Commissar for Nationalities, a position created by Lenin to manage the Soviet government's relationship with the various ethnic groups of the former Russian Empire. Stalin's Georgian background and knowledge of regional tensions influenced his selection for the role. In this position, he aimed to ensure the submission of peripheral regions to the central government, often using authoritarian methods. In the following months, Stalin took part in decisive meetings regarding the structure of the new Soviet state. He also contributed to drafting the new constitution and joined the Supreme Soviet. With the outbreak of the Russian Civil War between the Bolsheviks, Reds, and their opponents, Whites, Stalin was sent to several fronts as a political commissar, especially in the defense of Tsaritsyn, a city later renamed Stalingrad. His actions in Tsaritsyn revealed his leadership style, strict, centralized, and determined. He made military decisions without consulting the high command and initiated purges of officers suspected of disloyalty. Despite internal criticism, Stalin solidified his influence over the Red Army and gained further prestige among Lenin's close allies, who appreciated his readiness to act firmly in unstable regions. During the Civil War, Stalin focused on consolidating Bolshevik power. In addition to military missions, he coordinated repression against opponents, ensured the supply of weapons, and reinforced ideological control over the party members. His performance during this period strengthened his image as a man of action, efficient in carrying out orders, and ruthless with internal dissent. Even without the theoretical brilliance of figures like Trotsky or Bukharin, Stalin was increasingly respected and feared within the party structure. He built strategic relationships and manipulated appointments and removals in regional committees, giving him growing control over the party's bureaucratic machinery. While other leaders were engaged in planning and debates, Stalin was building a solid support base behind the scenes. By the end of the Civil War in 1921, the Bolsheviks had defeated their enemies and formally established the Soviet Union. Stalin emerged as an increasingly present figure at the center of power, though still under Lenin's leadership. His trajectory during the revolution and internal war already foreshadowed the type of leader he would become: practical, calculating, and deeply committed to centralizing state authority. The struggle for ultimate control of the party, however, was yet to come. With the end of the Civil War and the official creation of the Soviet Union in 1922, the Communist Party entered a new phase, the dispute over its future leadership. Lenin, weakened after a series of strokes, could no longer direct the party with the same authority. In this context, Josef Stalin was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party, a position that, at first glance, seemed purely administrative, but gave him direct control over appointments, promotions, and the internal structure of the party. Stalin used this position to build a solid base of support. He appointed allies to key local and regional committees while quietly weakening the influence of his adversaries. One of his main rivals was Leon Trotsky, considered by many the natural successor to Lenin. Trotsky had led the Red Army and played a central role in the Bolshevik victory in the Civil War, but faced resistance due to his authoritarian style and his defense of a permanent international revolution. Between 1922 and 1924, the struggle between Stalin and Trotsky intensified behind the scenes. Even while ill, Lenin began to distrust Stalin's growing power and dictated his famous political testament, in which he warned about Stalin's harsh and centralizing behavior. He even recommended Stalin's removal from the post. However, after Lenin's death on January 21, 1924, the document was suppressed by the party leadership, especially by those who preferred internal stability at that moment. With Lenin gone, Stalin began a meticulous process of isolating Trotsky. He used his influence over the party bureaucracy to restrict Trotsky's access to major decisions, decrease his political visibility, and accused him of ideological deviations. At the same time, Stalin formed temporary alliances with other leaders, such as Zinoviev and Kamenev, who also feared Trotsky's ambitions. This strategic triangulation allowed Stalin to progressively weaken his main opponents. In 1925, Trotsky was removed from his post as Commissar of War. The following year, he was expelled from the Central Committee. In 1927, he lost his party membership entirely. And in 1928, he was exiled internally to Kazakhstan, later being sent out of the Soviet Union. The man who once commanded the Red Army now became a dissident with no political influence in the state he had helped shape. The path was clear for Stalin to consolidate complete control. With no significant rivals left, Stalin now directed the party and the state with centralized authority. He began to construct a new Soviet order based on his own interpretations of communism and power. The state apparatus was reorganized to follow the directives of the General Secretary, and the media began promoting his image as Lenin's legitimate successor. Thus, Stalinism began to take shape as both doctrine and system of government. Internal repression intensified. Any dissenting voice was considered a threat to party unity. Stalin implemented a culture of surveillance and control, even among his closest allies. The security and intelligence apparatus grew stronger under the OGPU, which already operated forced labor camps and summary executions. Although the KGB had not yet been officially founded, its foundations were already in place. With power consolidated, Stalin prepared the country for a new cycle of economic and social reforms. His vision of communism diverged from some of Lenin's policies, especially the new economic policy, NEP, which allowed limited private activity. For Stalin, the time had come to accelerate industrialization and reinforce absolute state control over the economy and society. The next stage of his leadership would begin with the 5-year plans. With total control of the Communist Party in the state, Joseph Stalin launched, starting in 1928, an ambitious program of economic transformation, the 5-year plans. The goal was to accelerate the industrialization of the Soviet Union and turn the country into an economic and military power to rival capitalist nations. The first plan aimed to expand the production of steel, coal, oil, and heavy machinery. To achieve this, factories were built at a rapid pace, and mass migration from rural areas to urban centers was encouraged. Alongside industrialization, Stalin implemented the forced collectivization of agriculture, dissolving private farms and merging them into large collective farms, known as kolkhozes, and state-run farms, the sovkhozes. The justification was to modernize the countryside and ensure the supply of food to the cities and the Red Army. However, many peasants resisted, especially the kulaks, who were labeled as rich landowners or enemies of communism. The regime responded swiftly. Mass arrests, deportations, and executions followed. Millions of families were forcibly relocated to remote regions of Siberia or sent to labor camps run by the OGPU, the predecessor of the future KGB. The repression in rural areas was brutal, leading to a decline in agricultural production and worsening shortages. In some regions, such as Ukraine, the state's grain requisition policies caused widespread famine, resulting in millions of deaths, a tragedy later known as the Holodomor. Though the regime never officially acknowledged the disaster, its consequences were devastating for the population. While the countryside suffered, Soviet cities experienced rapid growth, driven by the construction of power plants, railways, steel mills, and military factories. Industrial efforts boosted production levels across various sectors, but at a high human cost. Workers faced exhausting shifts, unrealistic targets, and harsh punishments for sabotage or low productivity. Even so, official propaganda glorified the achievements as proof of socialism's success. Stalin used propaganda as a central tool to consolidate popular support and justify the sacrifices being demanded. His image was exalted in murals, newspapers, films, and books. The cult of personality intensified. Stalin was portrayed as the father of nations, the genius of humanity, and Lenin's true heir. Any criticism of the regime was considered treason. The totalitarian regime grew stronger with absolute control over the press, education, arts, and science. Within the Communist Party, a purification process was underway. Stalin began quiet purges of members deemed hesitant, critical, or merely suspected of disloyalty. Internal meetings turned into accusation and self-criticism sessions. Many were removed, imprisoned, or executed, feeding a climate of fear even among high-ranking officials. The repression extended to military officers, engineers, scientists, and intellectuals, including former allies of the revolution. At the same time, the state's surveillance and intelligence apparatus became more sophisticated. The OGPU expanded its network of informants across factories, neighborhoods, universities, and even within families. The Soviet environment was transformed. No one knew whom to trust, and silence became a survival tactic. Stalinism was no longer just a method of governance, but a way of life, based on obedience, surveillance, and devotion to centralized power. Despite all hardships, Stalin saw the results as positive. The Soviet Union, which had been largely agrarian and underdeveloped, now showed signs of industrial and military strength. According to Stalin himself, the goal was to catch up and surpass the West within a few years. The human cost was immense, but for the regime, progress justified the means. However, the situation was about to worsen further with the onset of the Great Purge, plunging the country into a new cycle of internal terror. Between 1936 and 1938, the Soviet Union plunged into one of the darkest periods in its history, the Great Purge, also known as the Great Terror. Josef Stalin, now with absolute power, launched a large-scale political persecution campaign targeting Communist Party members, high-ranking military officials, intellectuals, artists, peasants, and ordinary citizens. The official justification was to eliminate traitors and conspirators threatening the revolution's stability.
In reality, it was a process of full consolidation of Stalin's personal power and the eradication of any potential opposition within the Soviet state. The most visible aspect of the repression was the public trials held in Moscow. In these trials, former prominent Bolsheviks like Yanoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin confessed to absurd crimes such as conspiring with foreign powers or plotting to assassinate Stalin. These confessions were obtained through torture, blackmail, or threats against their families. Despite the lack of evidence, sentences almost always ended in execution. These trials served as political spectacles to legitimize the repression and demonstrate to the public that no ideological deviation would be tolerated under Stalinist rule. Behind the courts, a deeper and silent repression was taking place. Thousands of party members were arbitrarily arrested, deported to gulags, or summarily executed. The purges reached every level of Soviet society. No one was safe. Factory directors, teachers, engineers, doctors, government employees, workers, and even peasants were accused of sabotage, espionage, or anti-revolutionary behavior. Informing on others was encouraged, and often a mere suspicion of personal rivalry was enough for someone to disappear into the repressive system. The Red Army, one of the pillars of Soviet power, was also heavily affected. About 90% of its generals and thousands of officers were arrested or executed for alleged treason. The military elite was virtually destroyed, significantly weakening the Soviet Union's defense capacity on the eve of World War II. The forced renewal of military leadership allowed Stalin to appoint loyal individuals, but many lacked the experience or strategic skill of those purged. Fear took hold even among those closest to the center of power. Forced labor camps, known as gulags, spread across the Soviet Union, especially in remote Siberian regions. Millions of people were sent to these camps for indefinite periods under inhumane conditions. They worked on railway construction, mining, logging, and factories under extreme cold, poor nutrition, and armed surveillance. The mortality rate was high, and few survived for many years. For the regime, these camps were part of the economic system and also tools for political and social control. Official propaganda denied the excesses of repression and continued to promote Stalin's image as an infallible leader. Films, music, books, and plays glorified him as Lenin's true heir and the man leading the Soviet Union to progress. The cult of personality reached new heights. Children were taught to revere him in schools. His portraits were mandatory in public offices, and slogans portrayed him as the nation's savior. The truth about the purges was hidden behind an iron curtain of ideology. Stalinism, already established as a form of government, now became a way of life. Surveillance, censorship, fear, and absolute obedience to the leader shaped daily life. The Communist Party was the sole legal power structure, and any independent organization was quickly dismantled. The state apparatus became indistinguishable from the party, and both served Stalin's central figure. There was no longer room for debate, dissent, or criticism. Silence became the rule, and loyalty a condition for survival. Despite the climate of terror, the economic plans continued. New industrial targets were set, focusing on military production and strategic infrastructure. Stalin was preparing the country for what he believed to be an inevitable war against capitalist nations. Internally, he had built a political empire based on total control and nationwide mobilization. But external events would soon bring new challenges as World War II loomed on the horizon, Stalin's greatest test of leadership yet.
On the eve of World War II, Josef Stalin shocked the world by signing the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany in 1939. The non-aggression agreement between the Soviet Union and the Third Reich included secret clauses dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Based on this pact, Stalin invaded eastern Poland while Hitler attacked from the west. The Soviet Union also annexed the Baltic states and parts of Romania and Finland. The move aimed to buy time for Soviet rearmament, but it left the country vulnerable to future German betrayal. That betrayal came on June 22, 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in history. Millions of German soldiers crossed the Soviet border, catching Stalin off guard. In the first weeks, the German advance was devastating, destroying entire Red Army divisions and capturing vast areas of Ukraine, Belarus, and Western Russia. Stalin, initially stunned, refused to believe the betrayal and took several days to react. The Soviet leadership was unprepared, still weakened by the purges that had decimated its military ranks. Once he regained control, Stalin assumed supreme command of the armed forces. He mobilized industry for wartime production, relocated factories to the east, and decreed total resistance. The rhetoric shifted. Communism gave way to patriotism, urging citizens to defend Mother Russia from the invader. The Soviet Union entered total war, and the population was called to fight for survival. The Red Army was restructured with new commanders, reinforced troops, and strict discipline imposed on soldiers and officers alike. In 1942, the war reached its peak with the Battle of Stalingrad, the turning point on the Eastern Front. The city, bearing Stalin's name, became a symbol of Soviet resistance. German troops besieged the city in brutal combat that lasted months. Stalin forbade evacuation and ordered every street and building to be defended to the end. Soviet resistance, combined with the harsh winter and the well-executed encirclement by Soviet forces, led to the German defeat in February 1943. Over 300,000 enemy soldiers were killed or captured. Victory at Stalingrad was not only a military achievement, but also a major moral and political boost for Stalin. He was celebrated as a strategist and symbol of firm leadership. The Red Army went on the offensive, reclaiming territory and pushing the Germans back. The enforced industrialization of the previous decade, despite its human cost, helped sustain large-scale military production. Soviet resistance solidified the USSR's image as a rising world power. In the following years, Stalin took part in key Allied conferences such as Tehran and Yalta, alongside Roosevelt and Churchill. At these meetings, he negotiated the post-war division of the world, securing a Soviet sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Despite ideological differences, the Allies acknowledged the USSR's decisive role in defeating Nazism. Meanwhile, Stalin demanded territorial and political concessions to strengthen the Soviet bloc and the USSR's global strategic position. The war left deep scars on Soviet territory. Millions of civilians died, entire cities were destroyed, and regional economies collapsed. Even so, Stalin emerged victorious, both externally and internally. His prestige grew, and the cult of personality reached unprecedented heights. He portrayed himself as the architect of victory, and his grip on the party and state tightened further. Any criticism of his wartime leadership was silenced or treated as treason. With the end of World War II in 1945, Stalin repositioned the USSR as a global superpower. The defeat of Nazism and occupation of Eastern Europe paved the way for the global expansion of communist influence. From that point on, the confrontation with the West would intensify into a new kind of war, one without direct battles, but marked by espionage, propaganda, arms races, and ideological control. The world was entering the era of the Cold War, and Stalin stood at the center of this new geopolitical chessboard. With the end of World War II in 1945, Josef Stalin emerged as one of the most powerful leaders on the planet. The Soviet Union had played a key role in defeating Nazi Germany and now occupied vast territories in Eastern Europe. This strategic position allowed Stalin to consolidate his influence over countries like Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. Although these countries had their own governments, all began following guidelines aligned with the Soviet model. This ideological and geopolitical expansion became known as the formation of the Soviet bloc. During the Yalta Conference, held in February 1945, Stalin met with Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill to discuss the reorganization of Europe after the war. One of the main topics was the division of Germany and Berlin into occupation zones. Stalin demanded security guarantees for the Soviet Union and the right to maintain influence in the territories liberated by the Red Army. In exchange, he pledged to allow free elections in these countries, a promise that was later broken. Stalin viewed these regions as an essential buffer against future Western aggression. Months later, at the Potsdam Conference, with Harry Truman and Clement Attlee present, tensions rose. Distrust between the Soviets and the Western Allies was growing. Truman informed Stalin about the existence of the atomic bomb, but withheld details. Stalin, already aware through espionage, accelerated the Soviet nuclear program. The Cold War began to take shape. While the United States sought to contain communism, Stalin established loyal governments in every country within his zone of influence, reinforcing Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. The concept of the Iron Curtain came to define the political, ideological, and military division between the communist East and capitalist West. Stalin restricted contact between Eastern European countries and the outside world, imposed single-party regimes, and aligned their economies with the Soviet centralized model. Internal repression intensified. Censorship, surveillance, and political imprisonment became common throughout the Soviet bloc. The KGB, successor to the OGBU, became one of the world's most powerful intelligence agencies, operating with broad autonomy and international reach. Inside the Soviet Union, Stalin reinstated harsh ideological repression. Scientists, writers, artists, and even party members were persecuted for any trace of thought deemed bourgeois, liberal, or Western. Culture was tightly controlled, and any artistic work had to glorify the achievements of socialism. The regime maintained its narrative of being under constant external threat, using it to justify the lack of civil liberties and the strengthening of authoritarianism. The country's post-war reconstruction was marked by the intense exploitation of labor. Millions of Gulag prisoners were used to rebuild destroyed infrastructure. Industrialization once again became a priority, especially in the military and nuclear sectors. Despite the wartime victory, Soviet citizens faced food shortages, poor housing, and long working hours. The state retained total control over the economy, media, and daily life, while Stalin's personality cult reached even greater heights. On the international stage, Stalin sought to expand his influence beyond Europe. He supported communist movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, established alliances with countries like China and North Korea, and used diplomacy and espionage as strategic tools. The Soviet Union began competing with the United States, not only militarily, but also ideologically. The world had fully entered the Cold War, defined by constant tension, without direct battles, but with intense disputes across all spheres of power. Even amid this global confrontation, Stalin maintained absolute control. Any internal threat was neutralized, and surveillance increased. Fear became a central pillar of social order. The Stalinist regime had expanded beyond Soviet borders and solidified itself as the dominant force over a significant part of the planet. The Soviet Union had become the ultimate symbol of totalitarian communism, and Stalin, its undisputed leader, ruled the Eastern Bloc with a firm hand, aiming for new advances in a world increasingly divided between two opposing poles. In the early years following World War II, Josef Stalin intensified efforts to consolidate the Soviet Union's leadership in the new global landscape. The goal was to surpass Western powers in influence, technology, industrial output, and military strength. This ambition led to what many historians call the Soviet Great Leap Forward, a period of accelerated policies across various sectors, particularly in nuclear development, arms production, and a global spread of communist ideology. The effort involved massive investment in science, infrastructure, and international propaganda. One of Stalin's top priorities during this period was the Soviet nuclear program. Based on intelligence obtained through espionage, the USSR developed its first atomic bomb in 1949, just 4 years after the United States used the weapon against Japan. Possessing nuclear weapons dramatically shifted the global balance of power and confirmed the Soviet Union as a superpower. This advancement marked the beginning of mutual deterrence between the powers, when nuclear use became unthinkable due to the threat of global destruction. Still, investments in weapons production continued to rise. At the same time, Stalin expanded support for communist movements on other continents. Mao Zedong's victory in China in 1949 strengthened the socialist bloc in Asia. The Soviet Union established ideological and economic partnerships with countries like North Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba. Stalin saw these developments as essential stages in the fight against Western imperialism. The Cold War, although without direct confrontation between the USSR and the USA, evolved into a series of proxy conflicts, where each side backed governments and revolutions aligned with their ideology, deeply shaping global politics. Domestically, the country entered another cycle of economic and social reorganization. Stalin imposed new production targets, especially in energy, steel, coal, and transportation sectors. Thousands of workers were mobilized to meet central plans, often under severe pressure and state surveillance. The government used propaganda to motivate the population, glorifying labor heroes and emphasizing Soviet progress in contrast to Western capitalism. However, living conditions remained poor for much of the population, with overcrowded housing, lack of basic goods, and strict control over individual freedoms. Science and education became top priorities. The government promoted the training of engineers, physicists, and mathematicians with the goal of making the Soviet Union a global leader in technology and innovation. At the same time, school curricula was shaped to indoctrinate youth in communist ideology, glorifying the regime's achievements and omitting its failures. Ideological control over the youth aimed to ensure continued loyalty to the party and its doctrine. Stalin's cult of personality was reinforced at every level of the education system. Social surveillance reached extreme levels. The KGB monitored meetings, workplaces, schools, correspondence, and even private conversations. Informing on others was encouraged, and fear of being reported shaped daily behavior. Political arrests increased, and forced labor camps remained active, housing common prisoners as well as real or imagined political opponents. Even high-ranking officials could become targets if they showed any sign of dissent. The regime's logic remained absolute. Loyalty to the leader and the state was non-negotiable, and any deviation was met with immediate repression. Internationally, the Soviet Union escalated its disputes with the United States across multiple fronts. Beyond nuclear arms, the two powers competed for diplomatic prestige, influence within organizations like the UN, and leadership in scientific and technological missions. The rivalry extended into outer space, although the Soviet space program was still in its early stages. Stalin saw this struggle as part of the inevitable clash between opposing systems, Soviet communism and Western capitalism. Preparing for this confrontation demanded vigilance, discipline, and total internal unity. Despite all this control, cracks were beginning to form.
Social exhaustion, the rigidity of the system, and prolonged repression created silent tensions across various sectors of society. Some party leaders began to show fatigue or quiet dissatisfaction. As the world moved into a new phase of the Cold War, Stalin maintained his uncompromising stance. The leader viewed any hesitation as weakness and any criticism as betrayal. But the Stalinist era, which was built over decades, was nearing its final chapter, and its conclusion would come in an unexpected and definitive way.
In the final years of his life, Josef Stalin became an increasingly isolated and distrustful figure. His health gradually deteriorated, worsened by high blood pressure, heart problems, and strokes. Although he continued to exercise absolute control over the Soviet Union, his behavior became more unpredictable. Stalin frequently avoided meetings, kept his subordinates under constant surveillance, and believed he was surrounded by traitors. The paranoia that had long marked his political career intensified in his final years, affecting even those closest to the Communist Party's central leadership. During this period, Stalin launched a new internal repression campaign known as the Doctors' Plot. In 1952, several Jewish doctors were accused of conspiring to assassinate Soviet leaders. Without evidence, they were arrested, interrogated, and forced to confess. The case created panic in Moscow and paved the way for what might have been another wave of mass purges. Many historians believe that if Stalin had not died soon after, this episode could have triggered an even more violent and extensive repression than the Great Purge of the 1930s. At the same time, Stalin restructured the party once more. He created the Presidium, replacing the former Politburo, and implemented internal changes that gave him even tighter control over decision-making processes. Even in poor health, he continued to centralize power. He distrusted everyone, including long-serving figures such as Molotov, Beria, and Malenkov. No decision was made without his approval, and his aides avoided contradicting him for fear of severe punishment. The environment around Stalin was a constant tension, with no room for suggestions of dissent. In March 1953, Stalin suffered a stroke after an evening meeting with top officials. He was found unconscious on the floor of his residence, but his guards delayed calling for medical help, fearing the act without direct orders. The doctors who could have treated him were either imprisoned or dismissed during the doctor's plot. By the time medical care was finally administered, it was too late. Josef Stalin died on March 5, 1953, at the age of 74, leaving the country in silence and uncertainty. His death marked an end of an era, one of absolute leadership and unquestioned cult of the Soviet state's head. Stalin's funeral was a grand, intense event. Thousands of citizens gathered in Moscow to pay their respects, while many more listened via radio and followed the newspapers. His body was displayed in Lenin's mausoleum, and the party's top officials attended, though concerned about the future. The power transition began immediately, with Lavrentiy Beria attempting to take control. However, a void Stalin left exposed the fragility of a system built almost entirely around his figure. The personality cult maintained for decades centralized all decisions and created a structure with no clear succession. In the months that followed, the new Soviet leaders began an internal reassessment. Khrushchev emerged as a key figure, and in 1956 officially denounced the crimes of Stalinism in his famous secret speech during the 20th Congress of the Communist Party. This speech marked the beginning of de-Stalinization, an attempt to reform the Soviet system, reduce repression, and distance the state from the image of terror associated with Stalin. Statues were removed, prisoners were freed, and gulags began to be dismantled. The Soviet Union, however, did not abandon authoritarianism, but entered a new, less personalized phase. Stalin left a deep and contradictory legacy. He transformed an agrarian country into an industrial and military power, won a world war, and expanded Soviet influence globally, at the cost of millions of lives, extreme repression, and totalitarian control. Stalinism,
as both doctrine and system shaped the history of the Soviet Union and the entire 20th century. Even after his death, his figure continued to spark debate, revisited, criticized, defended, or condemned in different contexts. But on March 5, 1953, the man who ruled the USSR for nearly 3 decades left the world, and history moved forward. The death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 marked the end of one of the longest, the most impactful trajectories of the 20th century. For nearly 3 decades, he ruled the Soviet Union with absolute authority, deeply transforming its political, economic, and military structures. His government left lasting legacies that shaped the course of the Cold War and influenced regimes around the world. Even after his death, his decisions continued to echo through Soviet internal politics and international relations. The de-Stalinization process reshaped the face of the regime, but did not erase the marks of the system he built. Stalin remains one of the most debated figures in modern history, a symbol of a period of intense global transformation. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to keep following along.